On this episode of the AAF Exchange, Trump's tariff wars, deregulatory agenda, and the EPA's Endangerment Directive. Joining us to discuss all of this are AAF President Douglas Holtz-Eakin, Director of Regulatory Policy Dan Goldbeck, and Director of Energy and Environment Policy Pomerleau. Doug, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So before we jump into everything, why don't you start by telling us what's been on your mind recently?
Silly tax ideas.
Yeah.
As everyone knows, Congress is trying to put together a so-called reconciliation bill to address the sunset of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Reconciliation has lots of guardrails around it about increasing deficits and things like that, so there's a search for ways to offset any tax cuts they might introduce. The search for offsets always produces bad thinking because you want the money and you don't think about the policy. The most recent one is so-called corporate SALT. The state and local tax deduction was in the income tax. The 17 Act capped it at $10,000, and that paid for a lot of other provisions. About $1 trillion of tax revenue comes out of that. Those people in high tax states, many of those are blue states, many Republicans who have managed to get a seat in a blue state feel endangered by that provision. They would like to relax that $10,000, make it bigger, provide double the size for married folks. All of that is sent people in pursuit of a place somewhere else to get the money, and lo and behold, corporations deduct their state and local taxes too. So now we have sea salt, corporate salt, and sea salt is the current rage for let's cap that. But that's terrible tax policy. Taxes are a cost of doing business. When we tax corporations, we're trying to tax their net income, their profits, all their revenue minus all their costs. It would be like saying, well, let's not let them deduct wage costs. Well, that's a terrible idea. That's a big part of their costs or their capital costs or name it, their energy costs. There's nothing different about this. And so the notion that somehow you cap the sea salt is really the same as let's raise corporate taxes. But they've already agreed they don't want to raise the corporate taxes. They're not raising the top rate from 21%.
Right.
This would be the equivalent of raising it to like 23% or something like that. So that just strikes me as fuzzy thinking being driven by the constraints of reconciliation. But, if you want to do things on a party line and not do it in regular order, there's a price to pay, and this is part of the price.
Yeah. And a lot of this is to pay for some of those tax ideas, like no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security benefits, no tax on you name it from the campaign.
Yeah, to my eye, none of those fit into the bucket of things known as pro-growth tax policies. They all ought to be secondary considerations. You got to take care of the growth prospects first. That's the primary objective.
Yeah, I mean, it's a far cry from some of the stuff that you had written about in those Wall Street Journal
yes, one can dream.
where you guys argued for pro-growth tax policy that would have been good, sustainable growth for the country.
Yeah, but there is the reality that the president made a lot of promises on the campaign trail. It seems unlikely that the president will not want to fulfill at least some of them, and at least in part. And it seems really unlikely that a Congress can stiff a newly elected president entirely. So we're going to get some of those things.
Yeah, and to complicate things further, on Tuesday night, he said he wanted a permanent tax cut. He wanted the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to be permanent. So this is far from over, and we're going to have a lot more of these ideas to try and come up with the math for reconciliation.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing he mentioned, which he mentions a lot, but what hasn't people haven't quite dawned on the fact that he keeps repeating it. He wants to have a lower corporate tax on those who produce in the United States. This is an idea that was tried and rejected not very long ago. Oh, wait, that was the 17 Act. So, there's a lot to sort out here.
Interesting. All right, well, let's talk about something else that there's a lot to sort out on, and that's, of course, the trade wars. The trade wars did escalate this week with President Trump announcing his tariffs on Mexico and Canada will go into effect. I believe that was Tuesday of this week. It feels like it's been a month of a week already. And both countries have responded in kind with their own retaliatory tariffs.
Correct.
We now know that he's giving automobiles a month to catch up. What does this mean for the economy? Make sense of all this for us.
So there are now a lot of tariffs, 20% additional tariffs on China in two different announcements. Canada and Mexico, 25% each. Aluminum and steel, 25%. We have a lower rate on energy from Canada. The 1 month delay on autos, I will just flatly say I do not understand what that accomplishes. It doesn't accomplish anything substantively because you can't change these supply chains that cross the borders in a month. So I'm not sure what that turns out to be. But suppose you take that and just accept it at face value. Point number one is this is a lot more tariffs than he imposed in 2018-19 when he was first president. There are no exemptions to these. Last time there were still tariffs. Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina were exempted. They're not. So these are much tougher tariffs, and they're going to raise more revenue and raise more economic consequences.
Interesting.
That's for sure. Two things come up all the time. What happens to inflation? A rough estimate. There's a range out there of that the impact on the level of the personal consumption price index, the Fed's preferred measure, might go up by anywhere from 0.5 to a 1.5 percentage points. So that's the increase in the price level. How fast you get there, how much monthly inflation you get, not obvious. And then the wild card. Suppose people see prices start rising. You and I both know it's a level. You know, it's a just one-time event called tariffs. People might think of it as, oh, boy, inflation's back. Start thinking about higher inflation. Inflation expectations can be self-fulfilling.
Yep. And
then the Fed has to they're really caught in the crosshairs. And if they have to tighten, bad news for the labor market and for the broad economy. Second part of these, you raise the price level by a percentage point. That's a hit to households' purchasing power. That's a hit to the cost of investment goods. It's a hit to the economy, and it's going to have an impact on growth of, say, 0.5 percentage point, maybe up to a percentage point. We're already growing at something that looks like 2. You start getting a full percentage point. You're down in the 1% territory. That's a danger zone because we could go further south from there depending on events. So, at this juncture, the tariff war has produced some real negative impacts already, and they could play out even worse.
Yeah, I mean, household spending is already being constrained by continuing inflation. I mean, inflation. Fred wrote about egg prices. I mean, that's been everyone's favorite talking point. But
everyone's.
Yeah. It did produce a lot of good egg puns in the office yesterday when Fred did his video and on Twitter. I hope you saw some of them because we were hoping you would weigh in.
Category known as good egg puns is pretty thin.
Oh, you don't like your economics?
Oh, God.
All right. So, proponents of these tariffs argue that while there is going to be this short-term pain, we saw it play out a little
tiny
bit this
disruption.
Week, these actions are necessary for long-term U.S. economic and fiscal sustainability. What do you make of this argument?
I just disagree. I mean, these have nothing to do with genuinely solving fiscal problems. They're not going to raise anything close to the kinds of monies needed to close the $20 trillion in deficits we're scheduled to run already, 25 when they get done with the reconciliation bill. The upper bound of this is like $3 trillion over the next 10 years. So forget it. It's not a solution. The solution still lies in mandatory spending programs, and that's that. What economic problem is it solving? I don't know. You can make a case that there's some national security problems that might get solved by domestic protection of aluminum and steel, but that's a tough case to make because for all the good you do to aluminum and steel, you do more harm on the rest of manufacturing, and we need the rest of manufacturing for national security purposes as well. So I don't understand that. What economic problem are we solving? I think the president has never really said. He says he likes to have things in America, but you can't make everything in America. It doesn't make any sense. In fact, there's this great example, which is that there's no country on the globe that can produce the iPhone. You actually have to go around the globe to get all the different components and, rare earths and all the things that go into that. So what he's saying is, I want to give up iPhones. That kind of technology, that's not a good thing. We're not going to have that economic advance. It's not good economics, and maybe popular politics. And he may be able to sell people on the idea that the disruption is worth it, but I think in the end there will be disappointment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you know this, but I'm a avid iPhone Apple user, as I know you are, and that might actually get me to be protesting, which I am not generally a protester.
Well, I can make you sign.
Hands off my iPhone. All right, so where do we go from here, though?
This has always been the problem. Okay, so we talk about the Fed a lot on this podcast, and the Fed provides forward guidance. They do dot plots and say this is where we think interest rates are going, so what the outlook is for the economy. We have a 2% inflation target, so we have a place where we're supposed to end up, a destination. We have a trajectory to get to it. They're trying to, at all times, to convey that information. The president hasn't said where we're going. He hasn't said what would make him happy with Mexico and Canada. How long will it take for them to make him happy? So we have no target. We have no trajectory or timetable. So you can't answer that question. We literally don't know what happens next because it's whatever he decides next.
No.
And that's not, again, that's bad news from the point of view of the economy, because people in the economy are watching this and trying to figure out, what do I want to build and who do I want to hire and where am I going to sell it, and they can't make those plans in this kind of environment.
Interesting. Well, Doug, I know I'm going to disappoint all of our listeners that there's no trivia again this week, so you're off the hook again.
Oh, wow, 2 weeks in a row where I would have had it right. No, that's a shame.
Doug, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, Dan, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, there's been a lot happening on the regulatory front, so I just want to go through a couple of the things that have happened. We'll start with the president's executive order that came out a few weeks ago now, I think.
A couple weeks ago.
Yeah, so he issued an executive order requiring independent agencies to go through OIRA now for new regulations. Would you just break down what's happening there?
Sure. So there's was an executive order issued a couple weeks ago now that basically would direct independent agencies, so things like SEC and FCC, that typically don't need to do the same sort of analysis as the cabinet agencies. They now need to do that analysis and send it to OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, for them to review their work, basically. And so this sets up a situation now where you're going to get more analysis out of these agencies. It's not that they didn't do it. There were some requirements, but now they have a more rigorous requirement attached to their analysis, basically.
Yeah, so it doesn't sound like it's not like that bad of a thing, but it's something that now they just it's more centralized now, and it's less.
It's more centralized. Hopefully it produces, better cost-benefit analysis. There was another aspect of this executive order that is a little bit more interesting in that it actually asserts executive authority over these agencies more. That's going to be a little bit more dicey in terms of what the practical implications of that is. Mm-hmm. There's going to certainly be some legal challenges to that, I imagine. But for the regulatory review, I think it's generally a sound idea to have more analysis.
So where could we first see this pop up? Is there something in the works that you've seen, or are we just sort of wait and see mode?
Kind of wait and see. I think the aspect of this executive control over the independent agencies, involves setting up a White House liaison. It involves these agencies now coordinating with OMB in terms of their budget and management practices. And so if we see, some disagreement from the agency and OMB in the future, then that could set up a bit of a tiff. And then we'll see how that develops in terms of who ends up really being in control.
Mm-hmm. The Trump administration also has granted agencies the ability to not enforce certain rules, or put them on the back burner, if you will.
Yeah. So
what does that all mean?
So that was another executive order released around the same time. Part of that included expanding the remit of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, to take a more involved aspect in this whole regulatory review process as well. They're going to dive into figuring out rules to repeal or amend. But then the other aspect that kind of, set off my spidey senses a little bit was this deprioritizing of enforcement. So it sets up, language that directs agencies to, in order to preserve their limited resources, deprioritize the enforcement of certain rules. This is another thing. It's going to be kind of wait and see what the implications of it are. We've seen over the past, month and a half now, you have the regulatory freeze where you've had agencies delay the effective date or enforcement of certain rules that were finalized at the very tail end of the Biden administration. You also just saw last week the Department of Treasury essentially suspend enforcement of this beneficial ownership rule that involved small businesses having to file reports saying they're not fronts for illicit activity. That one's going to be more interesting because it's a pretty big deal of a rule. It's been litigated plenty. There's moves in Congress to change it, repeal it, etc. So we'll see exactly how long they have this in place, if there are statutory changes or what have you. But going back to the executive order, I think it will just be a matter of seeing, are we having these time-limited suspensions of enforcement authority, or are they more open-ended, essentially deregulating by just simply not enforcing, which, for some folks that might seem like a good idea, but I do think that there's some concern that you're essentially really degrading the rule of law with that kind of approach. I think it's important that if you want to repeal rules, you want to change statute, you go through the proper processes of those first.
Yeah, outside of that, it seems like you would want to actually go through the process of repealing these if you don't like those rules, because then a future administration can just come and say, oh, well, that rule is already on the books. We're going to
what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Again, if it's something that you agree, if it's an action you agree with, under this administration, sure, but then 4 8 years later, there's going to be a different administration that probably has different priorities, and you're probably not going to like that as much. So I think it's important to maintain the process as much as possible. So again, have to wait and see the exact implications here, but it is a little concerning.
All right. Well, I'm sure you will be a watchful eye and let us all know what's going on there. But there's one other bit of regulatory news that has been that's been very popular, and I know this because I think every other day or maybe twice in the same day you send me an email with an update to it.
Sure,
but
yeah.
We do the CRA tracker. Congress has started the process of reviewing a lot of those Biden-era regulations under the Congressional Review Act, some of those midnight 11th hour rules.
Sure.
What's the latest on all that?
So Congressional Review Act, as I think we've previously discussed, allows this Congress to go back and repeal certain rules produced at the end of the Biden administration, and for a set period of time in the Senate, they avoid having to go through the filibuster. So it's only a simple majority as opposed to counting to 60 votes. And so far we've seen, as of last week, there was one resolution dealing with an EPA rule that has passed both chambers. And actually just this morning, right before we started recording here, I went to check. There's one that passed the Senate last week and it was going through the House this morning, and so it's expected to pass as well. So we're going to be up to 2 that have passed both chambers. It's just a matter of time before they hit Trump's desk, and he, I think, is expected to sign both. And yeah, we continue to see a lot more activity on this front now that, particularly the Senate has moved on from some of its more major nominations. So you're seeing both chambers sort of churn through these, and I would continue to expect to see that over the next couple of months here, because that's going to be the window that they can really do this in.
What is the window that they have?
So it's 60 legislative days from sort of mid-January. So the expectation is going to be that it extends until about April, maybe early May. It kind of depends upon exactly how many days they're in session, of course. So they have this 2-month window, I think, is pretty reasonable at this point to expect. And, last time in 2017, they passed 14 of these, and then a couple others later on for some CFPB rules that happened later. Then under Biden in 2021, with Democratic support in Congress, they repealed 3 Trump-era rules. And so I would expect, again, to see a pretty active window here. I would not be surprised to see them exceed their total from 2017 if they keep at this pace of at least 1 or 2 each week. And I could see it really increasing and picking up here in the coming weeks too.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to keep an eye on that. And you have a great tool to keep an eye on that. The CRA tracker on the front page of our website. You update it. Like I said,
I'm going to need to update it as soon as we get off of this.
I'm sure I'm going to
stay tuned to it.
I'm going to leave the studio and come back to another email to figure it out. But Dan, thanks for coming in and talking to us about all this.
Yeah, thank you.
Shooting, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Are you excited? It's your debut.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So let's just jump right into things. The EPA recently signaled it was poised to reverse course on the endangerment finding. So to start, could you explain what this finding is?
Yes, so the EPA endangerment finding concluded that 6 types of greenhouse gases, they harm the public health and welfare. It is the legal basis for the agency to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, under the Clean Air Act, the agency has clear authority to regulate air pollutants. The question is whether air pollutants include greenhouse gases. In the case Massachusetts versus EPA in 2007, the Supreme Court held that, yes, greenhouse gases are air pollutants under Clean Air Act for the EPA to regulate them. The Supreme Court requested EPA to do a study to determine if the greenhouse gases would endanger the public's welfare and health. EPA in 2009 released the endangerment finding.
2009?
Yes, confirming that, yes, these 6 types of greenhouse gases, they do harm the public health and welfare.
So as I understand it, there's a lot of things spurred out from that. So there's been a lot of U.S. policy, climate policy around that. So why is the EPA targeting this finding? What is the impact of that, if any? Would reversing it have on U.S. climate policy?
Yeah, those are great questions, Kyle. Basically, on the first day President Trump returned to the White House, January 20th, 2025, he issued a lot of executive orders. One of those specifically requested EPA to study the continuing applicability of the endangerment finding. The consideration is if they repeal the legal basis for issuing regulations on greenhouse gases, then it would be much easier for EPA to roll back all the greenhouse gas regulations. That being said, repealing the endangerment finding and legal basis for EPA to regulate greenhouse gases may not have any material impact for EPA's authority to regulate the greenhouse gases because in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress added 7 sections as amendments to the Clean Air Act, providing clear and explicit authority and obligations for EPA to regulate these 6 types of specific greenhouse gases. So EPA still has the authority.
Yeah.
But this will definitely create chaos for U.S. climate policies because once they repeal it in the distant future, or I don't know how long it will take them to do that, there will definitely be legal challenges against EPA. It may take several years or even longer to resolve, and before everything gets resolved, it will be great uncertainty for businesses. They don't know if they will need to comply or they need to think of other strategies, and it's not good for businesses to plan and invest. It will be chaos.
So the court cases against that, those will be against the specific regulations that are in there, specific legislation on this, all stemmed from this finding. So now that finding doesn't exist, do these regulations still? Is that basically what's going on?
Yeah, so if they repeal the endangerment finding, the original legal basis, these EPA greenhouse gas regulations they were based on will no longer exist. Basically, it will mean that it will be much easier for EPA to roll back the regulations. There could be different ways why private entities or environmental organizations that would want to litigate against EPA, depending on how EPA would approach like repealing the finding. They could argue that, hey, we were wrong in our finding more than a decade ago. Actually, it doesn't harm the public welfare and health anymore. We need to avert the endangerment finding. Or they could say that because it's being codified in the IRA, we don't need this endangerment finding anymore. Either way, legal challenges will happen, and there will be lots of uncertainties.
We just had Dan on, and every time we talk regulations, there's, let's just hold on. There's going to be court cases. This is going to be litigated.
Yes.
It seems like that's always the case when it comes to these things. So it'll be interesting to follow, and we'll probably have to have you back on at some point in the future to talk about that.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. I hope this wasn't as bad as you thought. You're right. This was just a good casual conversation.
I had lots of fun. I look forward to the next time.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.